because learning changes everything. This is a trademarked phrase by McGraw-Hill. I believe that they use it for many of their textbooks, but it definitely applies here to intercultural communication, building blocks and barriers, Chapter 2 of Experiencing Intercultural Communication, the second edition. I'm Dr. Heidi, and I am going to explore this chapter with you. So the chapter outline here says building block 1, 2, 3, and 4 of intercultural communication. Obviously, these things are culture, communication, then also context and power, and finally, the chapter touches just a bit on barriers to intercultural communication. This week, I'm using the slides that came with the textbook. As you can see, they are significantly different from the slides I created last week. I'm going to encourage you to use more color and put a picture on every slide. Do those things so that the presentational aid is much more engaging for the audience. Why is that important? Well, this could be rather boring if this was the only way to use PowerPoint as a presentational aid. However, it does serve its purpose, though boring for the audience. So you might give it a try to add a little more color. I just wanted to use this to show you the difference. So does it work as a presentational aid? Yes. Back to the building block 1 of intercultural communication. So building block 1 is culture. As our definition says, culture is learned patterns of perception, values, and behaviors shared by a group of people that are dynamic and heterogeneous. Culture is learned. Culture involves perception and values. Culture involves feelings. Culture is shared. Culture is expressed as behavior. Culture is dynamic and heterogeneous. I'm not sure I agree with all of these things, including that culture is heterogeneous. Many people within a cultural group tend to be more homogeneous, which means they are more alike than they are different. Additionally, I do agree that culture is dynamic. It is ever changing, and the people within the populations are also changing. However, as you will see in the next image, there are some things that stay the same, and that's why they are considered a culture. There are different layers of culture, and many of these things do stay the same, though the visible behavior might change. The hidden behaviors of ingrained attitudes, values, and beliefs may not change very much over time. The visible behaviors are the things that we can see very easily, verbal and nonverbal communication. How do people speak? What language do people use? How do they interact with other people? What do they wear? Those are the nonverbal cues. So the second building block is communication. And of course, the people that wrote this book are communication experts. So they're going to focus a little bit more on this. Communication is symbolic. This is signs and symbols, ways that communication is emphasized, sometimes outside of what we say. It's more of the nonverbal, what we wear, how we interact with other people, what we do. There are many things that go into nonverbal communication. Our use of space, our use of time, many of those things are the symbols of communication. So communication is a process involving several components. The people who are communicating, a message that is being communicated, again, like I mentioned, verbal or nonverbal, a channel through which the communication takes place, and the context. So the channel through which the communication takes place is fairly important. Let's think about my communication with you here today. This channel is different than it would be if we were texting and using our phones to communicate. It's different than if we were meeting in a video chat. It's different than if we were calling. So there are a variety of different ways for the communication to take place through the channel. The context is very much the information that we are conveying and how we are conveying it. Again, we're on communication, the second building block of intercultural communication. Communication involves sharing and negotiating meaning. Communication is dynamic. It means it's ever changing. Communication does not have to be intentional. In fact, sometimes it's unintentional and we communicate something that we maybe weren't intending to communicate. So sometimes, have you ever heard that you should think before you speak, or maybe the expression, you put your foot in your mouth? That's just because we are saying things that we don't necessarily intend to communicate, or it's communicated in the way that we didn't intend for it to be perceived by the receiver. And communication is receiver oriented. In other words, we want to, as the speaker, get our message across to the person who's receiving it, to the listener. Though then they are returning information to us to let us know that this continual cycle is making sense in our conversations. Communication is a symbolic process whereby meaning is shared and negotiated. Here we also cover something called the knowledge gap. So I understand the information, I'm trying to explain the information to you, and then I want to know if you understood it. So the feedback loop is when people nod their heads, people say, yes, I understand, right, okay. These things are feedback. You can also provide feedback in significantly longer phrases and facial expressions, but the most common are those things where you are doing the active listening and not really interrupting the speaker. Culture and communication. Culture influences communication. So the way that we were raised, our backgrounds, the things that we learned as children, all of those items are included in culture and communication. So where did we learn these things? Well, values. It's what is judged to be good or bad, right or wrong, moral or immoral. And these values of a cultural group represent a worldview. A worldview is a particular way of looking at the world. So a worldview is based upon your values, beliefs, all those, and attitudes, all those things we saw on the bottom of the iceberg. And then it is the particular way of looking at the world. So what did you learn? What country were you raised in? What state were you raised in? What religion were you raised in? All of these things are part of your worldview, the way that you see the world, and the values that you hold. So Clucone and Strodbeck's value orientation. Now, you can say those however you want to. I'm not going to test you on how they're said. I'm just going to test you on the information presented here. So, what is human nature? What is the relationship between humans and nature? What is the relationship between humans? What is the preferred personality? And what is the orientation toward time? There are 3 possible responses to each question, and each cultural group has one or more possibility to preferred responses. So the next slide has a chart that will help us to understand this just a little bit better. The topics, remember, are human nature, relationship between humans and nature, relationship between humans, preferred personality, and time orientation. So response 1 for any culture and the values that they have are response 1, humans can be basically good. Response 2 is humans are a mixture of good and evil. And response 3 is that people are basically evil. Do we have a general preferred response in the United States? I would say we would probably say that people are a mixture of good and evil. However, it really depends on the culture you were raised in or the cultural beliefs that you hold. Relationship between humans and nature. Humans dominate, or there's harmony between the two, or nature dominates. There are people who believe in all of these things who reside within the United States and countries around the world. Relationships between humans, individuals, group-oriented, or collateral. In this case, collateral means like they're working alongside of each other, but they don't necessarily owe each other anything. There's not a group orientation per se, and individuals are not just out for themselves. In collateral, they're kind of working together, but more side by side. They don't owe each other anything. Preferred personality. In some cultures, doing, a stress on action, is more important. In some cultures, growing, stress on spiritual growth. And in some cultures, being, stress on who you are. Time orientation is important to cultures as well. Do they focus on the future? What's going to happen in the future? What is going to occur once you've achieved certain things? Or do they focus on being present oriented or past oriented, focused on the things that have happened in the past? Some cultures can include future orientation along with past orientation, focusing a little bit on present orientation. So you can see how this chart can get a little crazy and a little nasty, a little more difficult to understand, if you will. But these are usually the responses of value orientation, according to Kluckholm and Strodbeck. Hofstede also came up with value dimensions. Remember, like I said, this book is written by people who specialize in communication, and so this is going to be focused on people who are experts in communication. So Hofstede's value dimensions include power distance. This concerns the extent to which less powerful members of institutions and organizations within a country expect and accept the power that is distributed equally. For this, I would use an example of a doctoral student who I am currently tutoring in order to help her get her dissertation completed. She is a Black woman and a lesbian. These are two titles that she uses to describe herself. And in the current political situation, she feels that the power distance is very much strained with the current president not really understanding anything about her or her culture or her cultural identity. This is just an example, whether you believe the same way she does or not, or the same way I do or not. This is an example of power distance. She feels the people who have the power do not understand her and her way of living. I kind of agree. They don't understand me much either. Masculinity or femininity. This is the degree to which gender-specific roles are valued and the degree to which a cultural group values masculine or feminine values. So this you can see throughout many cultures, but one that I wanted to mention is the Two-Spirit people of the Native American tribes or the First Nations in Canada. They came up with a Two-Spirit people definition in 1990 or the early 90s. They came up with the idea that all people who didn't fit specifically into one category could be considered Two-Spirit people. Now, this is not a new term to the 1990s. This is just when they all agreed to use the term Two-Spirit, but people who have embodied masculinity and femininity within one person have been revered by the First Nations of Canada and the Native Americans of the United States for generations. I find this group of people and the way that they were valued as leaders, medicine men or women for generations, I find that to be very fascinating, and I believe that they are some excellent individuals that we should model the way we treat people after. Uncertainty avoidance is the degree to which people feel threatened by ambiguous situations and try to ensure certainty by establishing more structure. This not only happens in individual cultures. Uncertainty avoidance is something that we try to do. There's actually an uncertainty avoidance theory out there that says that we want to avoid any uncertainty, so we work to make the situation less ambiguous, which means we can understand it better. We know exactly what's going on. It makes sense to us. We want to avoid any uncertainty or avoid it at all costs, which makes it a little difficult to be intercultural communicators unless our idea is to minimize the uncertainty and to learn more about another culture. Again, Hofstede's value dimensions, long-term versus short-term orientation to life, concerns of society's search for virtue versus truth. Societies that are concerned with virtue or long-term orientation include China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, Brazil, and India. Societies that are concerned with truth or short-term orientation are the United States, Canada, Great Britain, the Philippines, and Nigeria. Indulgence versus restraint, related to the subjective feelings of happiness. Societies that follow free gratification of needs related to enjoying life and having fun include Mexico, Nigeria, Sweden, and Australia. I do definitely appreciate these societies, as it seems like they have a lot less pressure on the people within the society, and that they choose to enjoy life much more than the people in the societies that tend to suppress gratification of needs and regulate it by means of strict social norms. So this includes Russia and Egypt. Here it says other Islamic countries, but honestly, Islam is practiced in a variety of countries in a variety of different ways around the world. So I'm not exactly sure how they can lump those folks into this group. And then we also have China and India. So I could agree with Russia, Egypt, China, and India. But like I said, the other Islamic countries, I'm not so sure about that one. Building block 3 is context. This includes the physical, social, and virtual situation in which the communication occurs. Like I mentioned earlier, the context. It may consist of the following structures in which communication occurs. So when you are communicating in a communication interaction, it includes the physical, the social, the political, and the historical things going on at the time of the communication. So the power is always present when we communicate with each other, although it's not always evident or obvious. So this is what I mentioned earlier. In every society, a social hierarchy exists that gives some groups more power and privilege than others. Groups with the most power determined to a great extent the communication system of the entire society. Power is complex. One cannot really understand intercultural communication without considering the power dynamics in the interaction. So in different areas of the United States, I've seen that there are different groups of people who have the power. Now, we would like to say that generally, like the overarching government, federal government, or even the state government has the power. But that's not always true. There are other groups who have taken the power to their ethnic or social or political group within different parts of the country. So power is always present, but it can always be changing. It depends on who has the power. For example, right now I have power within our relationship because I'm the instructor. I'm the one who at the end of the semester will put your grades in the gradebook and on your transcripts. You don't get to vote on those. So I have the power. Now, do I share some of the power with you? Absolutely, because you determine the grade that I enter based on your effort this semester. The barriers to intercultural communication include ethnocentrism, stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. Words that we have used throughout all of time to describe why it is so difficult for people of different cultures to interact. Up until now, I've explained reasons why it's not so difficult, but we have to make the choices ourselves in order to be more effective intercultural communicators. So what is ethnocentrism? Well, it's a big word. But other than that, it's the belief that one's own cultural group, usually equated with nationality, is superior to all other cultural groups. Although not always equated with nationality, there are times when people believe that their religion is better than other religions, that their ethnic background or their heritage is better than all others. So it's not necessarily just nationality. It can be extreme to the point that one cannot believe that another's cultural values are good or worthy. This is unfortunate, but it often happens within different religions. If you're not willing to learn about another religion, or you feel that your religion is better than all the others, then it becomes a bit extreme. It may be a barrier when it prevents people from even trying to see another's point of view or through another's prescription lens, or the lens with which they see the world, their worldview. We can and do often accept other people for who they are and try to see through empathy how they view the world. However, it can be difficult to see our own ethnocentrism, so we can be ethnocentric without even really realizing. We learn to see our own ethnocentrism, and that may help us to be more receptive to learning about other cultures and about other people's way of living and experiencing the world. I have been in many countries and in many different places, and if I was unwilling to recognize that people see the world differently than I, it would have made the situations far more uncomfortable. I was absolutely willing to try the people's foods, learn their dances, learn their ways of communicating, learn the things that make their culture, and not just the external pieces, but the internal pieces as well. Stereotyping. Stereotyping is developed as part of our everyday thought processes. Stereotyping does not necessarily have to be a bad thing. It is the way that we make sense out of an overwhelming amount of information that we receive every day. We categorize and generalize from this information. So stereotypes are widely held beliefs about a group of people and are a form of generalization. Really, they are a form of the way our brain can categorize and process the information that we receive about others in our daily lives. Stereotyping is not innately bad, but when you begin to push the stereotypes that you have onto people and not learn about the individual within the group, that's when it becomes a bad thing. When our brain is just automatically categorizing, it's only doing that because it's trying to process the amount of information we receive every day. It's when you go beyond that to only provide the stereotype to individuals rather than learning more about their culture, that's when it becomes problematic. So this is why we stereotype. Stereotypes help us to know what to expect from and how to react to others. Stereotypes can develop out of negative experiences, which is when they become more negative. People tend to remember information that supports a stereotype and to not retain information that contradicts that stereotype. Stereotypes often operate in an unconscious level and are so persistent that people have to work consciously at rejecting them, which is what I was saying about you can, and our brains often do, put people into categories based on the first thing that we see. But when we stop there, that's when the stereotype becomes a problem, because the stereotype of a culture does not necessarily apply exactly to all the people within that culture. For example, I was raised a Catholic, and my type of Christianity might be different than other Christians, and my Christianity doesn't mean that I can't understand the value of Islam, the value of Buddhism, the value of Sikhism, and many other religions available to people throughout the world. If I choose not to learn, that's when it becomes a problem. Prejudice. Prejudice is a negative attitude toward a cultural group based on little or no experience. Stereotypes tell us what a group is like, whereas prejudice tells us how we are likely to feel about the group. Tokenism is a kind of prejudice shown by people who do not want to admit that they are prejudiced. Prejudice at one time included a colorblind approach to intercultural relationships that may have taught us to not notice color. Unfortunately, this is counterproductive to the improvement of race relations. Why? Because it's really not possible to do so. We can't really completely ignore the color of one's skin because this allows us to ignore, deny, or disregard the person, the individual. It is why we have racial inequalities, is because we are not allowing people to be who they are, to tell us what their background is. We just support the status quo. It discourages meaningful conversations about race relations. So, discrimination is the behavior that results from stereotyping or prejudice. This includes overt actions to exclude, avoid, or distance oneself from other groups. My ethnicity and my heritage is often denied of me, although some of you may say, well, why is that? Aren't you white? Well, okay, I might be white, but my background and my experiences are definitely my heritage, which is German, Irish, and Swiss. I do things like people from those countries. That doesn't mean that all of the other white people around me are doing things the same. They are from other and different countries who do things in other and different ways. I'm just using myself as an example, but I'm sure you could use yourself as an example. Where did your family come from? What do they hold as traditions? What's important to them? So discrimination here, though, may be based on racism or other isms, including sexism, ageism, and elitism. Sexism is preferring or saying that your gender is better than all others. Ageism is saying that people who are of different ages can't possibly understand things or do things anymore that they used to be able to do, or things that they haven't learned yet. And elitism is, of course, believing that if you are elite, you are better than everybody else. If you are part of the wealthy category, then you are maybe practicing elitism. This discrimination may range from very subtle, nonverbal, like a lack of eye contact or an exclusion of someone from a conversation, to verbal insults, an exclusion from jobs or other economic opportunities, to physical violence and systemic elimination of the group, or genocide. So probably the most popular genocide that we have learned about, and it's just popularity in learning. Obviously, I'm not saying that it was a good thing, but the one that most people learn about is the Holocaust. However, there have been other genocides throughout the world and throughout history, including some in Rwanda, Uganda, Sri Lanka, and Chechnya, some other European countries, of course, some other African countries. China also has experienced some genocide. South and North Korea do have a genocide of sorts, but theirs is mostly based on wanting to keep their race as pure as possible. Again, like I said, there's a lot of this that has happened historically, and hopefully we can learn from history so we don't do it again in the future. Hate speech is intended to degrade, intimidate, or incite violence or prejudicial action against a person or group of people based on their group membership. I'm sure many of you have heard examples of hate speech, so I'm not going to provide any here, but if you don't know, please go ahead and look them up. These things may be interpersonal, like relating from one person to another. It may be collective or institutional, like a group of people against another group of people, or an institution like a college or university, like a political institution, any institution that you can think of can, in particular, be biased against a culture or group of people. So building intercultural skills. When we build intercultural skills, we want to become more conscious of the identity of the groups in which you may belong to, both voluntary and involuntary. Become more aware of your own communication in intercultural encounters. So I've mentioned cultures outside of the United States or the United States itself, but there are many other cultures. Like if I would choose not to understand my parents' generation or the generations that have come after my generation, if I were to choose not to understand what it is like to live as a person with disabilities, disabilities that you can see for certain, like my godson and his brother, who are confined to wheelchairs based upon their muscular dystrophy diagnosis. I could choose not to understand them, to feel that I am superior to them because I can walk and they cannot. That's not true. We have to understand their worldview. So those are just some people within the United States. We want to notice how diverse our friends are. Do some of them have tattoos? Do they all look like us? Do some of them have nose piercings or ear gauges? Are they of different colors, sizes, and shapes? The only way that we can learn about other people is to actually engage with them. We want to become more knowledgeable about different cultures by reading local ethnic websites and blogs and foreign films. Of course, if you are going to do this, you need to make sure that you are reading accurate information. You want to notice how different cultural groups are portrayed in the media. When speaking about other groups, try to use tentative words that don't reflect overgeneralizations, and practice speaking up when someone tells a joke that is hurtful toward another group of people. As I have mentioned here, honestly, there are plenty of ways to build our intercultural skills. Let's start working on that today, now that we're more knowledgeable of the things that make up communication, culture, and barriers.